your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
The immortal line, "I died in hell, they called it Passchendaele," was written by Siegfried Sassoon, a friend of Wilfred Owen and fellow soldier poet. The Third Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele, in 1917, was one of the most infamous battles of the First World War, largely remembered for the landscape it was fought in. It was a cratered quagmire of sucking mud, scattered with burnt and shell-shattered trees, which could only be traversed on duckboards. It epitomized the horror of the Western Front and demonstrated the sheer destructiveness of industrial warfare. Massed bombardments, conducted with heavy artillery from miles behind the front line, changed the way in which infantry fought and physically shaped the battlefield itself. However, while Passchendaele matched the Somme in futility and almost in tragic loss of life, the two were certainly not one and the same. British tactics in Flanders, 1917, were much more effective than at the Somme, and the situation at Ypres was very different from France in 1916. At the Belgian town of Ypres, in West Flanders, the Allied line protruded into enemy territory, creating a salient. As a result, British soldiers around Ypres were vulnerable to attack by the Germans from three sides. Field Marshal Douglas Haig decided to launch a major offensive in the hopes of breaking through German defences at the Ypres salient and pushing on to capture vital U-boat bases on the Belgian coast. The collapse of the Russian army on the Eastern Front in February 1917, with the Tsar overthrown and replaced with a provisional government, meant more German troops were now heading west. This urged Haig to launch the offensive at Ypres quickly, before the German line was potentially reinforced. The Germans had taken up defensive positions on the Messines Ridge and in several villages around the salient, including St. Julien, Villers-en-Houcq, and Hooge. From these surrounding positions, the German artillery could bombard the British with impunity. Unlike the chalky ground at the Somme, the earth at Ypres was made of clay. This meant that trenches and dugouts quickly became swamped and filled in with liquid mud. Flanders is a natural marshland, which farmers have had to drain in order to farm crops. These drainage ditches were soon to be destroyed by artillery fire when the battle began. So when heavy rainfall came, the result was flooding and the infamous bogginess which characterized Passchendaele. Rather than dig a conventional trench system on the high ground at Ypres, the Germans built concrete pillboxes. These were virtually invulnerable to shelling, often being covered with mud and sandbags for camouflage and extra protection. Machine guns could be fired through narrow slits in the thick walls, ripping apart any attacking infantry. In stark contrast to their adversaries, the British positions at Ypres were no more than miserable, waterlogged trenches and dugouts. The British forces were an army on the offensive, so building any defences like that of the Germans was seen as a waste of time and money. General Sir Herbert Plumer was given the task of capturing the Messines Ridge. His plan for doing this was nothing short of extraordinary. British engineers had dug tunnels underneath the German positions, which were then packed full of over £1 million of explosives and detonated on the 7th of June 1917. This colossal explosion annihilated whole sections of the German line and was preceded by a fierce artillery barrage. Facing little resistance from their stunned enemies, British infantry advanced uphill with fixed bayonets and overran the German positions. However, triumphant British forces then hesitated for several weeks while Haig chose a new commander to lead the big push. This gave the Germans enough time to strengthen their defences along the rest of the line. Now led by General Sir Herbert Gough, on the 31st of July, British forces launched their attack on the formidable German defences. Almost instantly, heavy rain began to fall, transforming the desolate battlefield into a quagmire. British tanks were bogged down, German artillery opened fire, and machine guns wreaked havoc on the advancing infantry. The first day was a disaster for the British, but Haig and Gough were determined to continue with the offensive, even as the rain continued. In the August of 1917, West Flanders received nearly twice its average monthly rainfall. Artillery pieces were almost impossible to move, and infantrymen sank up to their waists in mud. An unknown number of soldiers and horses were swallowed up and drowned in the nightmarish morass. With the failure of repeated assaults on the German defences, Haig finally replaced Gough with Sir Herbert Plumer. In September, the British changed tactics from full-scale to small-scale attacks, now focusing on limited objectives. The Second Army would attack the Gellivelt Plateau, while the Fifth Army was tasked with capturing the Ypres Ridge. Plumer had amassed a huge number of artillery pieces, one gun for every 5 meters of front, which laid down an intense bombardment. The German positions were swept by a storm of shrapnel and explosive shells. On the 20th of September, British troops went over the top and advanced towards the Germans behind a well-timed creeping barrage. This was a tactic used to clear the ground ahead of an infantry attack and keep the enemy's heads down, hindering their ability to fire on the advancing infantry. When Plumer's men reached their objectives, they dug in rather than pushing onwards. Although the attack was a success, it was certainly a Pyrrhic victory. The British had suffered 21,000 casualties in return for just 5.5 square miles of ground. With this methodical approach, Plumer was able to bite and hold, slowly gaining ground from the Germans, but at a high cost. In October and November, the 3rd and 4th Canadian Divisions attacked German troops atop Passchendaele Ridge. This was the action which gave the battle its name. Having lost many men to the German machine guns, and with rumours circulating about German soldiers bayoneting POWs, the Canadians gave little quarter. Corporal Baron wrote that the Canadians were infuriated at the general morale of the men, the German machine gunners, who would maintain murderous shooting until imminent danger pressed, and then calmly sue for mercy. In spring 1918, when the Germans launched the Spring Offensive, British forces were forced to abandon the ridge so many Canadians had died to capture. This begs the question, was the bloodshed at Passchendaele actually worth it? It has been estimated that both sides suffered around 260,000 casualties at Passchendaele, although even heavier losses have been suggested. One German source claimed that British successes at Passchendaele had brought the German army near to certain destruction. Indeed, German casualties were exceedingly heavy, and these losses were harder to replace than for the Allies because of Germany's smaller population. There is also no question that German morale was damaged by the grueling fighting. However, the British gained only a small amount of territory, which was then abandoned during the Kaiserschlacht, so it is hard to say that either side really won the battle. However, it would be fair to say that Passchendaele hurt the Germans more than the Allies, as it severely damaged their morale and drained them of irreplaceable manpower.